Hey everyone, welcome to my new video. Today I will be talking about my latest scene, this space theme animation that I've made, and I want to show you different parts of the process. So we'll go from initial idea and sketching through the modeling and texturing, and I will show you all the parts that I found interesting and noteworthy. So I really hope you will enjoy this one, and if you do, please don't forget to leave that like, and if you're new around here, hit that subscribe. Now let's jump right into it. And let's start where every project starts, and that's with inspiration and some references and sketching, of course. At least in my case, I really find it useful to sketch before I go into modeling, so I can offload my ideas first, and then I know what I'm doing when I go into 3D modeling. But even before that, I need to go out and see what I want to make, and basically every other week I come up with the theme I want to make. So currently I'm really into space stuff, so I naturally wanted to make something related, so I came up with this space hauler theme, because I didn't just want to make like a battleship or something like that. I really like the idea of, hauling cargo through space. So my initial reference were mostly focused on that, so you can see different images that I gathered, mostly focused around different spaceship from different universes, or existing games or upcoming games. So you can probably see some Star Citizen stuff, you can see some Starfield, and again, as I said, some upcoming games probably. And again, the common theme here is that these are all kind of freighters, spacecrafts that are carrying a cargo through space. So I was focusing on things that will really make this visible on the first go, and I really like these like visible cargo containers, and I really loved these kind of designs. So then I just went and narrowed down some of the things that I liked the most. Here I kind of like this separate cockpit idea, and I really loved these like clamps that you can put a cargo between, and that's basically how I meant my initial design. When I started sketching, I was planning to do much smaller craft with that cargo container in the front, but as I went, I really didn't like the sketch in the end, so I went back and refined it and remade it into something different, and remade it into much longer shape, added some more volume in the front, so it felt a little bit more aesthetic and more pleasing to look at, because I think that's integral part of whatever you're trying to make. So for me, this was a little bit more guesswork in the sketching phase than usual, because I really had to redo this few times until I got something I liked. But then it was time to move into Blender and start creating the 3D model. And if you're just starting Blender and you have trouble following all the tutorials and videos on YouTube, make sure to check out my courses as well, where in addition to the step-by-step instructions, you also get full in-depth explanation of all the steps and all the tools, and you get to learn everything from simple low poly design all the way to full character illustration, textured environment, a little bit of sculpting, hard surface modeling. And now you can get all of this with 50% Black Friday discount until December 3rd. So if you're interested, please check out the link in the description. So the first thing I needed to do was some general block out, because I didn't have any blueprint or existing thing. I only had my references and my sketch. So I started playing with the shapes and moving them around in Blender, and extruding stuff and modeling the shape, and basically just getting to the rough shape of the spacecraft as soon as possible. And then occasionally I went in and refined some of the geometry. So for example, some of the parts that I sketched in, a little bit rounded, I went in and made sure that these have some nice topology and consistent mesh density. Same for the cabin, for example, where I really made sure that this is subdivided correctly, and I actually used the subdivision there in the end, because the cabin is probably the place where your eyes will linger a little bit longer, so I wanted these shapes to be nice and smooth and easily textured. So that's why I spent a little bit more time on the mesh. But on the other hand, some of the other parts are really low poly and simplified, and they rely mostly on bevels. So you can see these like clamp structures here in the middle. These are very low poly, and basically they use booleans to sculpt the shape more than anything. And speaking of shape, I didn't went into too much of a detail. I mostly focus on parts that defined the contours, the shape of the craft. So for example, here I have this cutout, that's the integral part of the shape, or this larger cutout on the side. So those are the things that I modeled in, but the rest of the detail that I had sketched in, I knew that I will either do them on a texture level or that I will kit bash them in later as model details. So that's why the initial blockout is very simple, and this allows me to move fast and move to the other stage of the modeling. And that was basically making sure that it all feels a little bit more natural and connected. So I went in and create all kinds of pipes and pipe structures that would hold these things together, because I only had these engines like slapped on the side with nothing holding them there. So I created these structures from certain angles. You can see that there is actually something holding the ship together. Same on the side here. I put different pipings and different structures there to suggest that there's actually something holding the ship together. And additionally, this also serves as a second level of detail, adding more variation and more visual interest to the ship. And also this was the part where I started to add some modifiers. So for example, on these very simple low poly shapes like the containers, I would go in and add some bevel modifiers, or for example on the parts that had a little bit more dense geometry, but the curvatures weren't so apparent. So from the distance, this doesn't need, any subdivision. But on the other hand, here in the front, as I said before, this is quite curved. So with the low poly mesh, this would look jagged at certain angles and certain close-ups. So I wanted to make sure this is nice and smooth. So I used subdivision modifier there. So if you look at the wireframe, the ship is kind of combination of different mesh densities and different approaches to create most eye-pleasing result. Please bear in mind that if I wanted to export this to, for example, a game engine, I would go in and re-topologize this into more low poly and optimize the result and bake every detail and every bevel and those very small details into the texture. So this is something I didn't have to worry about, because this was meant only as a model for Blender animation. And now, of course, I wanted to move into texturing as quickly as possible as well, because I finally wanted to see how the ship would look like, because there's always a little bit of a guesswork when you're progressing like this, and at this stage you really don't know how this will look like. So adding those textures will allow me to see places where I might need to add some more details or model something in. And I used the different sources for this. So for example, for the hull texture, I just found this, nice industrial image and created like a fake roughness and fake normal map from it, because I really loved all the details and things that are already baked into image texture like this. Because when you're working with like a standard PBR textures, these can be quite clean and you might need to add a lot of like decals or grunges later. But when you're working with real image samples, you get all of these like imperfections and dirt baked in. And a lot of times I can see they produce more natural results, especially for a spaceship like this, where this kind of material will be visible under really strong light. And then I basically just went and searched for, different texture packs. All of them are free and mostly CC0. All the links are included in the description, so if you want to try this on your own, you can get the textures and give it a go. And of course, next week I will be sharing the full time-lapse process of this if you want to really follow what I did here. Now this time for the texturing, I wanted to try something new, because before I was mostly using like substance textures, or if I wanted to create and texture hero asset with its own UV maps, I would use Substance Painter. But I'm trying to keep more and more of the process within the Blender, so the things I do are more accessible as a learning resource. So I tried the yoke paint add-on. It's available in the extensions, and it basically supplies a layered texturing functionality similar to Substance Painter. Of course, it's far from Substance Painter, so today if I had a need to create a really professional AAA looking asset, I would still probably go with Substance Painter, because there you have all these pre-made generators and masks, and basically it's really easy to do things with Substance Painter. But so far I really like this, and I will be using it going forward, and I will try to get as close to the setup I had before with the Substance Painter, and we'll see how that goes. But generally, I really love the add-on. I think it adds a lot of functionality and makes layered materials super easy to set up where you don't need to go into the shader editor and create all of these nodes yourself. Because remember, the add-on doesn't do any like magical new stuff. It basically just works with the nodes that are available in Blender underneath it all. So with the initial texturing done, before I moved into any additional details, I still wanted to see like the overall result as quick as possible. So I just went in and, you know, finished the scene setup. So I imported some HDRI with the space background. Again, this is a free resource. You will find the link in the description, and just set it up as an environment texture. I created a simple sunlight, very effective setup for space scene. You basically rely on a strong single source of light from, you know, a sun or a star, and then I just try to compile everything with the camera and with the planet shape I wanted to have in the background, similar to my sketch. So that's what I went for, and try to tweak it a little bit as soon as possible so I can see the final result. And I also added bloom right here in the viewport as soon as possible, because the bloom effect is important part when you're creating a sci-fi scene like this. So that was basically the end of the initial prototyping, blockout, and some initial texturing and lighting. And now I could go back in and refine all the parts that I felt that need refining. But before, of course, I needed to finish the planet, and I decided I want to do this procedurally, because there are a lot of textures out there you can download for certain planets, for example, even fictional ones, but I wanted to do this myself. So I created this planet shader, where mostly, if I isolate this and, you know, disable the lighting, you can see this is the material, and basically it's just the noise texture that has its vector driven with another noise texture, and it's driven by the same parameters for the scale, for the roughness, and for the gain. So this kind of simulates the old Musgrave texture. And then I just connect everything to a color ramp here, and, you know, I can shift the colors here, or I can tweak the factor there and determine how the textures are mixed in. And then finally, I'm just adding some layer weight with Fresnel, which is this outside halo, to kind of simulate a little bit of an atmosphere there. And I wanted this to feel a little bit alien, so that's why I created, you know, like a really strong red and blue planet with some greenish atmosphere. And when you enable lighting here, you can see how this Fresnel reacts with the light coming from the side. And then I just duplicated the whole sphere to create this clouds layer. And again, this is a noise texture. It's the same setup that I used to create the terrain, but here I'm using the noise texture to drive the volume shader. So you can see there's no surface, there's only volume shader here, and I'm using some color ramp values to drive the density and the color to create these kind of clouds. And finally, if I remove this, if you look from the side, you know, this transition is a little bit too harsh, even with the volumetric clouds. So I wanted to create like a more natural atmosphere transition. So basically, I just duplicated this sphere once more and created another volumetric shader, but this time driving just the gradient spherical texture through the color ramp to create this halo on the edge there. And in the end, I think it produced a really nice planetary result, which I could then duplicate to another planet here on the side. And then I could move to some other procedural elements like the thrusters here, which is very simple setup. Basically, it's just a gradient texture that kind of cuts the thruster from the back here. So it adds the alpha there, and then it's masked with the noise texture that's really stretched using the mapping node. Here you can see how it's stretched on the x-axis. If I would reset this, you will see this becomes a normal noise texture, but stretched like this, it produces this really nice result suitable for thrusters. And finally, I could move on and create some additional details, but generally I felt the ship looked a little bit too flat, so I thought I will try to play with the containers a little bit more, and I added multiple layers of these, and I really loved the result. It kind of made this more rough, more robust, more industrial. And yeah, generally I just liked this idea. So I kept the containers and I created the shader that just assigns the random color to the containers, so they're not all the same. And then basically I just created all these little details here, these little shapes, you know, combined with the pipes, with the different textures on them. And additionally, I created some pipes that I can duplicate around, and these were really easy to just, move around the model and snap on the surfaces. So as you can see here in this cutout, I have this small detail that's just snapped in. Here is the same thing, and I can even combine some of these. So for example, here these are two objects right there. Here there was some cylindrical objects that I felt were needed to create, more visual interest. Same here, and then a little bit more of those pipes and small details in those cutouts, like here and here on the sides. So again, I just incrementally made more and more renders and render previews and added detail where I felt the ship was, feeling a little bit too flat or uninteresting. And finally, I just made a very simple animation of ship moving and, then slowing down in the end, and basically just played with the camera angles, which was integral part of this process. Because with the space animations, to put something really in perspective, you can use tricks like focal length of the lens. So for example, here if I go to the camera view, you can see I'm looking at it from a distance, and here if I select the camera, you can see this is 50mm of the focal length, but then I just do this like aggressive zoom all the way to 200, and this really kind of makes it flat. There's almost no perspective at all, and it really feels like the ship is in the distance and there's this large planet behind it. Speaking of the planet, as you might see, this is not to a scale, because doing this to a planetary scale is not viable, of course. So I just made this sphere really large and put it behind the ship, so it might feel in the animation this is in fact a real planetary size object, when in fact it's kind of faked this way in the Blender scene. And then I just moved to a different shot like this, where the camera just dollies across the ship a little bit like this. And then finally the frontal view, where we have the ship slowing down, and here I'm firing up those front thrusters. So you can see if I play it back, these thrusters are firing up and basically slowing down the ship, so it feels natural and at least a little bit realistic. And then finally it was all about the render setup, where I progressively tried multiple renders and multiple setups and saw what needs to be, improved, if I need some effects, if I need some changes in lighting. I put the volumetric all around my scene, so I have a little bit of a haze here, if you can see this, and that really softens up the background, the planet, the asteroids, which I added using really simple geometry node scattering, because I really wanted to have some additional visual interest here in the corner, because the scene felt a little bit flat and empty without it. And then I put this, really glowy object to the side here, and felt some lens flares might be nice. So when I open Compositor, you can see this really simple setup where I have the glare for the bloom, for the initial bloom, but then I have a glare for these lens flares, which are really stretched out, and you can really see like these RGB dots there. And then finally, with the new Blender 5, we got these awesome compositor presets. We have this, asset browser shelf, and there is some pre-made stuff you can use, like the split toning, which basically colors highlights and shadows separately for your scene, and my favorite chromatic aberration, which will kind of distort and displace your RGB channels. If I really go strong, you can see here like we have this blue, red and green parts of the image really split. But just the subtle adjustments, just the subtle effect is more than enough to make this feel a little bit more cinematic. So all of these, the bloom, the glares, the aberration, make this feel a little bit more cinematic. And then I also play with the color management and with the new ACES view transform. Before I would be using the AGX, now I tried the ACES, and it genuinely felt like it offered a little bit more dynamic range, especially with the color information. So I kind of tweaked it a little bit with the curves, and this was basically my final render setup for rendering the animation. So that's it for my latest scene. I really hope you enjoyed this rundown. Please let me know in the comments if you enjoy this kind of talk, if you want to see more like this for my future scenes. And again, stay tuned if you want to see this in detail. I will publish a full time lapse of this process next week. It's more than 6 hours of a raw footage, so I will probably posting this like 2 or 3 times sped up. But remember, you can always slow down the playback in the YouTube player when you watch this. So that's it from me today. Again, I really hope you enjoyed this one, and if you did, please leave that like, and if you want to learn everything Blender, hit that subscribe. Thank you all for watching and have a wonderful day.